Alright guys, welcome to week 25. This week we're studying the age of anxiety and nationalism, or the gap about 15 years in between World War I and World War II. It's interesting content, but as you know, the week after spring break, it's a hard week to get motivated, but let's get it done. So, post-war pessimism. After World War I, all of the tragedy, all of the death, all of the destruction. Remember, World War I, there was never a war, anything like it, with the amount of death, the amount of destruction. So we're going to see that people are essentially shell-shocked, and that term comes into being after World War I because people are horrified by what happened. Gertrude Stein terms the phrase lost generation to describe all the people who were in World War I and experienced it, because they were never the same again. Everything has changed, and society will become a lot more expressive in order to deal with the tragedies in which they saw. Now, after World War I, there's a lot of disillusionment. People believe that society has failed. Look at these terrible things that have been done. Obviously, what we're working for, it doesn't mean anything. There's going to be a lot of pessimism as well over the idea of human progress. The idea of progress is essentially being laughed at during this time period because it's progress that brought us to this war of nations. It's industrialization that's called this war. It's imperialism that's called this war. You're going to see that the gentleman Spangler, who wrote The Decline of the West, thinks that this is the end of Western civilization, and that because of World War I, we'll never fully recover. So a lot of really down and out people. Now, a lot of really good things are happening during this time period too that are going to change the world in a very positive way. Albert Einstein, he has the theory of relativity. He believes that time and space vary and are fluid, not fixed like previously thought. Heisenberg, he believes in the uncertainty principle. He is all about hydrogen, and he believes that things will never stay constant but always stay the same. And he believes that that the world is always varying and changing place. Now, both the work of Einstein and Heisenberg and Freud, who we're going to talk about in a second, are going to have obviously practical, applicable science topics, but they're also going to have a social and a cultural aspect. Now, Sigmund Freud is going to believe in the life in the subconscious of mind, and he believes that the repression of sexual desires and fears is what is the motivating factor behind our behaviors. His ideas, thoughts, and behavior treatments are going to be the foundation of what we would call modern psychology. He's known for his interpretation of dreams, free association, and he uses these to associate with mythology, religion, literature, and art, and becomes a cross-cultural figure. Now, art and experimentation are going to have a booming impact during this time period. Now, photography is becoming a much more accessible, much more powerful aspect of art. Because of photography, we're going to see that artists no longer have to have perfect images of the people in their portraits. Now, artists, specifically painters, feels that they can interpret what they're seeing. They don't have to give a realistic vision of them because we have photography now. So we're going to see a new type of art called abstraction come into place. The most famous artist is going to be Picasso, and it's going to be influenced by a lot of non-Western, so a lot of African, a lot of Asian influences, Indian influences that are going to become more prominent. Architecture is also going to be experimented with. Remember, the world has changed after World War I, and these people are trying to find their way in it, so they're trying to do things differently. We're going to see that square lifeless is no longer going to be the common. We're going to try to see exaggerations and skyscrapers and all the things that are going to be modified and changed in order to have more of an impact and express themselves. Now, the Great Depression is going to probably be the most important, both economic, political, and cultural component of the age of anxiety. Now, how it comes about is because Austria and Germany, after World War I, have to pay reparations according to the Treaty of Versailles, or they have to pay back all the money it cost England and France and a little bit to the United States to wage the war. So what we're going to see is that Germany and Austria are going to borrow money from the United States in order to pay back France and Germany. Well, France and Germany are going to be getting money from France, and England are going to get money from Germany. And England and France are going to be buying American goods with that money on a much larger scale than previous because all of the factories were destroyed. So essentially, money leaves the United States and goes to Germany. Germany then turns around and gives it to France and England, and France and England turn around and buy American products. So Americans are getting paid on two fronts. They're getting paid back the money of the loan, and then they're selling all the goods. So America is doing incredibly well for quite some time. However, this whole system of making money and having a lot of money coming in from Europe is dependent on U.S. cash flow. So as long as the cash flow coming out of the United States is good, then it's going to come back in the United States in manufacturing and industrialized goods, all these different types of components. However, by 1928, about 10 years since World War I, England and France have rebuilt up their infrastructure to a degree, and there's a lot more competition for manufactured goods. England is really going to struggle with paying back some of the loans, but more importantly, Germany is going to fail their ability to repay the loans from the U.S. Now, before we talk about the complete crash of the economy, we have to understand the different parts of the economy. One of the newer parts of the economy is single export countries. These are countries who only deal with one export. That's all they do. They only deal with rubber. They only deal with chocolate. They only deal with tobacco. There's only one good being exported. Now, prior to the Great Depression in their region, depending on what region they're from, will dictate how successful they were. Immediately after World War I, rubber and metal and all of these other raw materials necessary for production were in high demand. So those countries were doing really, really well. However, when the Great Depression kicks in, there is nothing else they can do to subsidize their income because they focused only on one product. And we're going to see that's going to be a huge issue in the Dutch East Indies, Malaysia, and Ceylon. Now, what is also going on prior to the Great Depression, especially here in the United States, is agricultural problems. Now, the reason why agriculture is such a big problem here in the United States is because post-World War I, the United States was never bombed. We had no fields destroyed in wartime or in the trench warfare or anything like that. So after World War I, all of Europe had their fields completely destroyed, torn up, metal everywhere, trenches everywhere, cemeteries everywhere. So the problem is they didn't have the ability to grow wheat, which is obviously a staple of the European diet. So here in the United States, we had all of our breadbasket here in the Midwest, and we started overproduction of wheat. We grew too much wheat. We began depending on our wheat production. Now, the strongest harvests were in 1925 and 1929. However, overproduction is throughout the entire 1920s. Wheat at its lowest price in 200 years in 1929 because there are so many people selling it here in the United States. Now keep in mind, the war ends in 1918. By 1919, people are growing things in Europe. So there's an overproduction or surplus of goods, and they start drying out all the nutrients because growing wheat takes a lot of nutrients out of the soil, and a lot of this topsoil becomes very light, and it gets blown off essentially the prairies, and then what becomes the Dust Bowl in the mid-1930s. Now, the beginning of the American Great Depression is going to occur in October 24th, 1929. It's known as Black Thursday. The stock purchases are on a margin. About 3% of them are on margin. What happens is Europe tells the United States, hey, by the way, Germany's not paying us back. We're not going to be able to spend that much money. You know, Germany stopped paying their loans. So investors are getting all this information from Europe that the money is no longer moving from the United States to Germany to England and France back to the United States. So investors start getting nervous. What happens is a complete snowball effect. One thing triggers another thing and then triggers a bigger thing. And essentially all of the average American citizens are losing their life savings, whether on a bank run or by stock industry. On actual Black Thursday, 11 suicides occur from stockbrokers, but the consequences of later on of Black Thursday are going to be more significant, and things get worse. Now, the U.S. economy is going to completely collapse. Because of the inventory surplus, there's going to be a lot of layoffs. Because we have so much grain, grain's not worth much. Since grain's not worth much, no one's making their profits back. If people aren't making their profits back, then they have to fire the people that work for them. If they have to fire the people they work from, now all of a sudden they're out of a job, and now they're wandering around the country saying, I don't know what to do. Now, in 1932, the industrial production is about half of it in 1929. So, because of tough times, both the industrial and the agricultural side, jobs are being lost everywhere. People aren't buying goods. If people aren't buying goods, then industrialized goods aren't necessary. About 44% of the banks are out of business because of deposits lost. Mostly because they're run on banks. People are concerned about their life savings, so they went to the banks and asked for them to receive their life savings, and because of the overwhelming amount, essentially people lost everything. Now, the Great Depression is going to affect, of course, the world economy as well. It's going to hit countries that are dependent on export of manufactured goods for essentials like Japan really harshly. It's going to affect countries like Germany and England and France pretty severely too. Excuse me. Also, single export countries like South America are going to be completely destroyed, which will lead to future problems, which FDR is going to get involved in here shortly. Now, what's going to happen is that the government is going to try to get involved immediately as soon as we start seeing the crisis coming. Now, the U.S. is going to go under a plan called Planned Scarcity, which means all fruits and vegetables and animals were destroyed that were in surplus. If you ever read Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, it's about two farmhands who have no jobs and who are going around looking for jobs and the struggles in which they experience and all those trying times. That's essentially what they're seeing. The government's limiting how much can be grown, how much needs to be destroyed, and that's hurting the economy. But they're trying to do a good thing, but it hurts the economy, and it's a tough situation. So, new economic strategies are going to be attempted to satisfy the need of the people and to stabilize the economy. Laissez-faire and planned scarcity approaches are going to fail. They're so harsh and very challenging to deal with. They fail. John Maynard Keynes is going to come up with an idea to stimulate the economy by lowering interest rates. And it works, actually, because it encourages investing and employment. It's going to work. We still use it, actually, today in 2014 when we had, in 2012 and 2011 when we really had a market shakeup. The New Deal is going to be one of the best things to help us get out of the Depression. However, the United States gets officially out of the Depression during World War II. And buying and needing all those wartime goods. Now, what's happened in Russia, just a quick review. The Bolshevik Revolution is going to happen. The October and November Revolution, 1917, the Soviets take over, of course. The Civil War rages from 1918 to 1920, which, is just Russian killing Russians. Then we have the Red Terror, which is the execution of the Tsar. The Whites defeat the Red Army in 1920 and all these things. Defeated by the Red Army and all these things are happening. So the idea of communism is seen as a terrible, terrible thing. Well, under all of these problems and consequences, we're going to see that Lenin is going to try to strengthen the Soviet Union, and he's going to do rapid collectivization. He's going to collect up all the small farms and make them into large farms and make them government supported, which means the people themselves are going to be running the land in a more communist way. It's going to be run by the government, but the people themselves work on the farms and get food from the farms. So think about it. It kind of makes sense. The larger the farm, the more food you get. It makes sense ideologically. It doesn't really work out that well in practice, but we'll get to that. Confiscations are occurring. If you have a lot of land and a lot of wealth, your land is going to be disappearing in order to serve the better will. So that's not very popular with the wealthier. Massively unpopular is going to be the rapid collectivization and confiscation. No one wants to lose their land, and no one wants to be forced to work land they didn't want to. This is going to cause some problems for Lenin. However, in 1921, he is going to come up with a new economic policy, and it's going to have partial privatization, or some people are allowed to work in a capitalistic way, while some of them are going to be in communistic, depending on who you are, where you are, and in what part of the country you are. So it's a little bit of a hybrid, not as hybrid of communism and capitalism like China, but it's kind of a beginning stages, because he saw that communism, or the idea of communism, specifically socialism, was not working effectively. Now, this new economic policy is going to temporarily restore a market economy or a capitalistic economy, and there's going to be some private enterprise. Because the transition was so harsh, it was very challenging for them to deal with. Allowed peasants to sell surplus at free market prices, electrification of the market, which means stimulates the market very quickly, and establishment of technical schools are going to allow the Soviets to become much more advanced. Now, eventually, Lenin is going to die. He suffers a stroke. After the first stroke, he starts transitioning power to a guy named Joseph Stalin. Now, between all of Lenin's well-to-doers, they're not well-to-doers because they're terrible people, but all the people below him are going to have a power struggle to become the next leader of the Soviet Russia, and of course Joseph Stalin is that man. Okay, Stalin triumphs over his party rivals. He's known as the Man of Steel. Socialism is going to be a huge thing and continue to lead, and the Soviet Union is going to he's going to start his power in 1928. Now, Stalin is actually a great thing for the Soviet Union. He has the 5-year plan, known as the Goose Plan. He has massive collectivization of agriculture. By this point, the Russians have kind of saw it before. They know kind of what it's about, and they kind of much more down for it. They're called the kulaks. Now, there's going to be a lot of resentment and kind of hatred for the kulaks, but they do work to a degree. I mean, the people of Russia aren't eating well, but they're at least eating. Stalin halts collectivization in 1931 and proclaims it's a massive success. Now, Stalin is also trying to eradicate the populations of Russia. He calls it the Congress of Victors versus the Congress of Victims. He believes that the Civil War has created two groups of people, obviously the victors and the losers, and he needs to clean Russia out of them. Now, Stalin removes all people suspected of opposition. So if you said one bad comment of like, oh my God, I don't like Stalin's hair today, you could essentially be kicked out of Russia or killed or, you know, whatever. 2/3 of the Central Committee, or the people directly under Stalin, were wiped out and removed from Russia or killed. Half of the army's high-ranking officers were taken out, and most of them were sent to labor camps or gulags. Not a great place to be. A lot of suspicion, a lot of fear, and people were just being taken advantage, and this secures Stalin as a all-powerful leader. Now, there is going to be a growth of European fascism. It's a symbol of authority, is essentially what it comes from. It originates with Benito Mussolini, who is an Italian reporter, and his fascism is going to influence Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Now, the major points about fascism is not communism. Hitler did not want all people to be equal. He wanted him to be powerful, and he wanted his will to be followed through. Fascists do not want equality. Fascists want the state should be more important than the individual. They have one leader, and that leader has all power. They are ethnocentric, which means their race is superior to all other race. They are militaristic, which means they need to have the biggest, baddest, strongest army. They're anti-communist. They hate communists. They distrust them. They hate them. They're chauvinistic. They believe men are the most powerful thing and women are subservient and shall never challenge the authority of a man. And finally, they're xenophobic. They don't want any newcomers. They only want their types of people. Now, fascism is going to rise in Europe because of the Great Depression. Now, in Italy, for instance, the poor showing of Italy in World War I and the Italian governments, they're disappointed with weak territorial gains. Technically, they were on the winning side, but Italy didn't get anything out of the Treaty of Versailles, and they're just disappointed and annoyed. They fought for the Entente at the very end, and they thought they should have gotten more. Now, granted, they did jump sides, which is why they didn't get much, but they felt they were entitled to more. And they're also economic and social turmoil, mostly because of the Depression that's hurting the world at this time. Mussolini, like I said, is a former newspaper editor. He leads a march on Rome in October, and King Emmanuel III offers him an office as prime minister, as trying to appease him. If he gives him a government position, then he won't try to take his, kind of thing. And Benito Mussolini calls him and his group the Black Shirts. In 1926, about 5 years after he takes on his march to Rome, he becomes the power or the leader. Now, Adolf Hitler is probably the most famous of the fascist rulers, even though Mussolini does give him a good run for his money in the beginning. In 1921, he becomes chairman or a leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. He did not start the Nazi Party. But he became one of the most, obviously the most famous of the Nazis. He attempts to overthrow the government in 1923 and does not go well. The Weimar Republic do put him in jail for quite some time. He does write Mein Kampf in jail, which is massively popular. It's My Struggle is the title in English, and it's all about his life story of how how he has grown up and how the Jews have ruined everything, and all of his complaints against the Weimar Republic and how the Jews are responsible for everything, all the problems. Now, he does capitalize on public dissent with the post-war era. He blames the war guilt clause, reparation payments, as major crimes against Germany. He believes that the major parties are unable to come to any type of consensus, which is hurting Germany with indecisiveness and anti-Semitism. These are the major foundations of the Nazi Party. Now, the Consolidation of Power, they become the single largest party in parliament from 1930 to 1932. Now, Paul von Hindenburg is going to appoint Hitler as chancellor in order to try to appease him and kind of keep him in place. It does not go well, because once Hitler gets some power and some authority, he suppresses opposition and he suppresses constitutional and civil rights, just like you'd expect him to do. He makes the Nazis the sole legal party, destroys trade unions, purges judiciary and civil service of perceived enemies. He just does whatever the hell he wants. Well, one of the most famous components of the Nazi theory is the racial state. Now, Hitler is a believer that Jews are the cause of Germany's problems, and he has a lot of theories of racial superiority and racial purity. Now, eugenetics is actually a worldwide thing of the purity of a race, and he, through his new government position, does a compulsory sterilization of 30,000 Germans. If you had any type of psychological disorder, physical disorder, mental disease, if you were Jewish, those types of things, you were forced to be sterilized or you weren't able to reproduce. Abortions illegal for healthy Germans, and mandatory for hereditary ill and racial aliens. So you were not allowed to have a child with someone. If you were a true German, you weren't allowed to marry or especially reproduce with anyone non-German. The euthanasia program kills about 200,000 more people. So the use of abortion kills about 200,000 more people. I mean, it's a pretty terrible thing. This will eventually lead to the Holocaust. Now, anti-Semitism has been floating around the world for 2,000 years at this point. However, laws start passing, specifically the Nuremberg laws, which are going to start defining Jews on racial basis, and they prohibit marriages, they remove laws of civil service and Jews. There's all of a sudden no businesses allowed to be visited or purchased by non-Jews. The official start of the Holocaust is going to be Kristallnacht, which is the Night of Broken Glass, and it's going to be a countrywide pogrom on the Jews, or the removal of the Jews, and it's very successful. Like I said, it's the official start of the Holocaust. Now, focusing on nationalism in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Now, India really wants to be able to rule themselves, which makes sense. The Indian National Congress is founded in 1885 to promote self-rule. This was done in pursuit of independence, just like the United States. Now, initial support from both Hindus and Muslims for independent country from British rule. However, after World War I, we're going to see a lot more opposition of the Hindus and the Muslims working together. Now, the British are going to encourage the development of Muslim League in 1906, But we're going to see that that's eventually going to lead to a huge rift between the Hindus and the Muslims. Now, Woodrow Wilson and Lenin are inspirations of movement to unify. Now, Gandhi is probably the most famous Indian of all. He is a Hindu, and he studied law in London and practiced in South Africa. He opposed the apartheid, who are going to we're going to be dealing with here in a couple weeks, actually in 2 weeks, with president in South Africa. We'll see him in a couple weeks. Anyway, he returns to India in 1915 and made the National Congress into a mass movement. He is titled Manhattan, or Great Soul, and he opposed the caste system completely. He is going to be the revolutionary leader. Now, he believes in passive resistance. He does not believe in a war. First of all, smart man, obviously. However, he knows he cannot beat the British by fighting. The British are, even though it's post-World War II, post-World War I, and they're still struggling to recover, he knows he can't beat them. So he starts doing nonviolence, and he calls it Ashima, which is nonviolence, and Satagafa, which is passive resistance, or truth and firmness. Now, they're going to have a couple movements: the non-cooperation, civil disobedience movement, boycott of British institution, and the Amistad massacre. All of these passive resistance are going to be done with no arguing from the Hindus. They're just going to make peaceful protests and let the British kind of, do their thing. Now, the government of the India Act is going to create an autonomous legislature. There's going to be 600 nominally sovereign princes refuse to cooperate. They don't want to have a legislation, so they don't participate. Now, the Muslims fear the Hindu dominance, and they now want to have their own territory, which will later become Pakistan. They believe that there's a traditional economic divide between the two, and that they cannot be together, especially with the Great Depression and how severe it was economically. The gap between the Hindus and the Muslims is so severe, negative for the Muslims. They believe that they can't be in the same country together, and they need to be separate. Now, jumping into China, the revolution of 1911 forces Emperor Peiyu to abdicate. We're going to see Sun Yat-sen proclaim the Republic of China in 1912. We're going to have political anarchy is going to follow. Everyone's just doing whatever they want. Total chaos. Now, independent warlords are going to exercise local control, and we're going to see that there's just no uniforming power. Now, the Chinese nationalism is really going to start with the May 4th movement. What's going to happen is students and urban intellectuals protest foreign interference, especially the Japanese, because the Japanese have taken over a lot over Germany's territories. The British and the French are a little distracted post-World War II. So we're going to see that the idea of Marxism is going to be increasing in popularity, and we're also going to see the Chinese Communist Party founded in Shanghai in 1920 around this time. Now, Mao Zedong is going to be the big nationalist leader. However, we are going to see that he is going to have some opposition as well. Now, Sun Yat-sen is going to create the Nationalist People Party, or the Gomnadong. Now, he accepts support from the Soviet Union. He believes that communism is the end goal. He believes that you have to go through capitalism to get to communism, quite unlike Lenin and, of course, Stalin. But we're also going to see that he is going to try to lead this transformation. Now, eventually, all of these conflicts with these three different leaders, especially when you include Jiang Jiechi, we're going to see that these two leaders are going to go blow to blow, the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party. Now, Jiang Jiechi is going to be take over after Sun Yat-sen, and he's going to oppose Mao Zedong head on. Now, he launches a military expedition to unify China and turns against communist allies. So he's going to fight back and kind of separate themselves from the communists. Any communist Chinese are going to flee to northwest China, and this is called the Long March. And this is going to make Mao Zedong essentially a hero amongst the people, because he's seen as, oh my God, look at what he's done and come through. Now, imperialist Japan is going to be signing treaties under the League of Nations to limit imperialist activities. They are forced to stop taking over countries. However, that doesn't really go well. Now, because of all of the transition of World War I and to the age of anxiety, we're going to see that political chaos is going to exist in Japan, and there's going to be a lot of assassinations. So a lot of political turmoil going on within the country. We see that militarist and imperialist circles advocate greater assertion of Japanese power in the region, and China is a very soft target because they got a lot going on. One of the biggest incidents that are going to affect it is the Manchuria incident in 1931. The Japanese troops in Manchuria, China, secretly excuse me, blow up small parts of a Japanese-built South Manchurian railway as a pretext for war. So the Japanese are going to declare a slight war on Manchuria. This is where the start of Japanese aggression is really going to start taking place, which will directly affect World War II eventually. Now, over opposition of Chinese civilian government, the military takes Manchuria and renames it Manchukuo, and it becomes a puppet state. So they're not Japanese, but they're definitely not Chinese. Now, the League of Nations censures Japan, and they have to pay costs, and they say, I'm sorry. However, Japan refuses to do so, so they leave the League of Nations, and they have no consequences. Now, after World War I, Africa is going to be greatly affected by the Great War. The colonies are going to participate in World War I. After they get done fighting for Britain or France or whatever European country, they want their freedom. Okay? The Allies are going to invade German-controlled colonies. The Africans are encouraged to fight white soldiers in these German-controlled colonies. Many Europeans are left to be deployed elsewhere. So a lot of Africans are still having a ton of European influences because all of these soldiers just haven't left. They are going to encourage local rebellions and challenge is to the European domination, because all these people are starting to talk into the Africans' ears and challenge them, which is what they want in the first place anyway. Now, Africa's new elite, there's going to be a brand new elite class, often influenced by education. Now, Jomo Kenyatta is a Kenyan nationalist. He moved to create modern states in Africa, and he created the Pan-Africanism, which was promoted by Marcus Garvey in Jamaica, which means back to Africa, which means all of our freed slaves and everyone in the United States who were from Africa should go back to Africa and make it a better place. We're also seeing a lot of transition and changes in Latin America. For instance, U.S. influence are going to be protested by university students. We're going to see that they're looking to explore alternate political ideologies, specifically Marxism, and that's not what the United States wants, because we're capitalists and we don't want to have Russian influence too close, which will eventually lead to a Cold War. Fidel Castro is going to turn Cuba, Jose Carlos Mantegue is going to turn Peru, and artist Diego Rivera is going to have huge influence in Mexico. I'm so sorry about coughing. The United States is going to have economic domination in Latin America, of course. Of course, we remember the Monroe Doctrine, which said other European nations cannot colonize in Latin America because it is their territory and it's theirs as in it's the U.S. territory, and they should not be intervened. Now, the Great War is going to ensure the U.S. domination, which means the U.S. is the most powerful country after World War I. For a good amount of time. England and France will catch up, but the United States is dominant. Latin America doesn't have really a choice except to deal with us. Now, the huge capital investments in Latin America and the export of raw materials is going to be a huge part until the Great Depression. Now, the U.S. economic neocolonialism is going to be the highest under President Taft. Now, he believes in this thing called dollar diplomacy, and he believes that they're not being imperialistic, they're not dominating them politically, economically, and socially. They're just going to take over and do what they need and leave when they're done. So it's a nicer imperialism, and that's going to be led under Taft. Now, FDR is going to come in position and become president after Hoover, and he is going to avoid direct intervention. He doesn't believe that imperialism is correct, So he sends everything you need to start a war and gives it to the locals. So his hands are clean rather than, killing people. It's the natives killing people with American guns. U.S. Marines train local militias, and they go out and conquer and help assist people conquer. Now, Nicaragua is going to be a huge place where American troops are going to have a huge influence. The U.S. is going to support Anatisto Samoa Garcia in the 1920s. Now, he is opposed by Augusto Cesar Sandino and leads opposition. Now, Samoa assassinates Sandino and maintains good relationships with the United States. So people are winning, and then there's more trade and more economic profit. Now, the Mexican developments are not going to be as lovely. Now, Roosevelt formally renounces intervention as per the Monroe Doctrine. He says he won't do it. However, we're going to see that Lázaro Cárdenas is going to nationalize the Mexican oil industry in 1938. This was previously held. The United States and the British were the ones controlling the oil first, and this is not a good thing for the Americans. So, because this isn't a good economic thing for the Americans, Roosevelt convinces the U.S., British businesses to accept $24 million in compensation, even though they wanted $260 million. Okay. Now, the reason why is because the U.S. wanted to retain some support of Mexico with the approaching war. Also increases dependence on Mexican immigrant labor here in the United States. So we didn't want to piss them off too bad, but, we had to get our little fist in there anyway. All right, guys, that is the end of week 25. I hope you have a great week. I know it's a lot of work with that focus and that spice, but we are charging through. If you don't understand the age of anxiety, everything in period 6, if you don't understand the week before, you're in big trouble for the next week. We are so close. We are so close. Keep it going. You can do it.